Well, hello to everyone. I'm so pleased that you're with us today. We are now 54 days out from the general election, and yet the voting has already begun. In the state of North Carolina, absentee ballots have already been shipped out to those people who'd already requested them. And so it is possible that as we are talking here today, somebody is at their breakfast table filling out their ballot right this minute and about to ship it back in. So the general election season is not in the future, it is right now with us now. I'm Wendy Underhill. I am the lead of the elections team at the National Conference of State Legislatures, and it's my pleasure to be your host here today. We have looked at the registration, and it looks to me as though most of the people who are here are in fact from legislatures, which makes sense, that's who we serve. And then there are other people from other nooks in the election world as well, and we're glad to have you too. You may have some different perspectives you want to share with us, and thank you all for coming. So I did start by talking about the general election, but it's a little odd. That's on our minds, but what we're here to do is to look in the rearview mirror at the primaries from this year. And I have to say that the primary season is not entirely over yet. Yesterday, Rhode Island had its state primary, and next Tuesday, Delaware has its for the last one in this season. So we are wrapping up the primaries before the primaries have actually been wrapped up. So we're looking today to get some lessons learned from what took place during the primaries, and that should help us with the general election, but more than for the general election, it will help us as we look at policy making into the future, next legislative season and beyond. So to get these lessons learned, we've invited three people who are really in the know on primary elections and what's going on in the states. We have with us Speaker Scott Psyche from Hawaii. He is the president-elect of NCSL, and we are very delighted that he's willing to serve in that capacity. And then after we hear from Speaker Psyche, we'll turn to Secretary of State Paul Pate from Iowa. He is the past president of the National Association of Secretaries of State, and NAS and NCSL work very closely together on elections things, and we really appreciate NAS as an organization and his leadership of that organization and willingness to be with us today. And then we'll turn to Rob Ritchie, who's the executive director of Fair Vote. And what I can tell you about that is that it's nonpartisan, and that Rob is the person that NCSL turns to when we need information or advice relating to ranked choice voting and a number of other issues as well. So before we get started, I do want to suggest that you all could turn off your phones. You could turn, which I should do as well here in a moment, turn off your email if you can, and then prepare to use the chat box. The first thing you could put in that chat box is where you're from. That would be interesting. But what has your takeaway from your experience voting in the primaries this year been? Where were you when you did your voting? At home, in a polling place? How did you make your decision? Was there something that was unusual about it? We'd just love to gather up some of those stories from you all in the audience. And Speaker Psyche, that's what I had to start us off with. If you're ready, I'm going to turn it over to you, and Christy will get ready with the slides.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. Thanks to NCSL for hosting this webinar. I think that this is these topics are just very timely and very important for all state legislatures and for the territories. So thanks for inviting me. Hawaii this year went through two new election changes. So the first was a statewide all-mail system. And second, we did use a ranked choice voting system in our Democratic primary caucuses. So I'll go first through the all-mail system. And I have some slides, but I have to tell you, I'm kind of bad sometimes with following slides. I'll try my best, and I'll just summarize. Our primary was on August 8th, 2020. And I'm on Act 130, still Act 136 slide. We approved our all-mail system on a statewide basis in May 2019. And so our state elections office did a really good job in working over the past year to organize and implement the system. There are some general parameters that we provided for in our legislation. So first, as I mentioned, this is a statewide system. It began with the primary election. In lieu of polling places, we created and required that voter service centers be established on each of our islands in Hawaii. We allowed for, in addition to the mail-in, we allowed for in-person voting with some limitations at the voter service centers and through drop boxes. And the deadline for the receipt of ballots was election day at 7 p.m. So in Hawaii, we have our system is shared between the state of Hawaii elections office and the 4 county governments. So the state elections office is basically responsible for printing ballots and overseeing the elections. The counties are responsible for collecting and counting ballots within their counties. So there were a few reasons why we finally approved statewide mail-in voting. The first was logistics. It was just really, and I'm sure all jurisdictions go through this, it's just so difficult to staff polling sites throughout the state. Second, our absentee ballots had increased. So the rate of absentee ballots, as you can see on this slide, in 2014, our absentee mail ballots began to outpace the in-person ballots that were being cast at polling places. And the third reason was that we wanted to address the low voter registration and low turnout that had been, trending for the past few years in Hawaii. We have a slide here on the first year startup costs. We appropriated $1 million for implementation, and that basically covered 3 areas. First was public education, equipment, and then signature card updates. Well, I think it's a slide the first year startup costs slide. Okay, so these are the first year startup costs. The major one was the signature card updates. The county clerks made an extensive effort to update signatures and to update addresses for voters throughout the state. The total cost for running the election was almost the same as prior years. There was a projected savings of only $57,000. And as you can see on this slide, there are 2 areas. Could we have the next slide? The 2 areas where we saw significant savings was in the cost for election day officials, but that was offset by the cost of postage because Hawaii does prepay for the return postage for ballots. Okay, the next slide. We have, this is just a graphic of the polling places. I mentioned that that it was just very logistical to organize polling sites. We have 250 polling places in the state. This is prior to the absentee system. But we reduced that to 14 voter service centers and 35 drop boxes in our state. Okay, the next slide. Voter registration increased 7% this year in the primary. Next slide. And then we also had a significant increase in voter turnout. We've always had really low turnout in Hawaii, but this year in the primary, the increase was at 51.2%. Okay, the next slide. This for lessons learned for the all-mail system. So as I mentioned, the advantages were the cost savings, the savings in terms of logistics, staffing, polling sites. We had a really good communication system that provided public education on the new system, and it was just easier for voters to register and to vote. Disadvantages were there were a couple of areas. One was that from the campaign perspective, I think candidates had to adjust to the new timetable. And second, there was a slight delay in the counting because there was an unprecedented number of ballots that had been dropped off at the voting centers on election day. So that caused a delay from Saturday night until Sunday morning to count those remaining ballots. Just wanted to also highlight a few more things. Our absentee ballot, our mail-in ballots were mailed to voters approximately 3 weeks prior to the primary election day. The deadline to receive them, as I mentioned, was 7 p.m. on election day. Following the last printout, there is a 5-day window for the clerks and for voters to challenge ballots and to challenge signatures or to correct signatures. So the clerk's office has actually identified the problematic ballots and contacted those voters and gave them the opportunity to correct their signatures or to correct their to verify their ballots. We also had a system in place, and this was an online system where voters could go online to check the status of their ballot. So the system would tell them whether or not their ballot had been received by the clerk's office. So that was a pretty good system that people were happy with. Okay, so I'll just pivot briefly to the next slide, which is on ranked choice voting. So on the next slide, we have Hawaii was one of 5 states that used ranked choice voting in the presidential primary this year in 2020. And I'm sure Rob can give us more details on what's happening nationally. So on the next slide, we have our presidential primary was on May 22nd, and Democratic Party holds caucuses throughout the state. There was a delay this year because of COVID, but it kind of, the party had actually made a decision prior to the pandemic to use a ranked choice system. So it kind of dovetailed very nicely to have that system in place. On the next slide, the Democratic Party contracted with the Merriman River Group to conduct the ranked choice voting system. So Merriman basically ran with everything. They did the ballots, they contacted the voters, they ran the results. We have on this slide, it shows that the Democratic Party mailed about 79,000 ballots to party members. 35,000 were returned for a turnout of 44.28%. It was somewhat low, but because our primary was held on May 23rd, it wasn't very exciting because at that point, Vice President Biden was already the presumptive nominee. The only other candidate that was really campaigning that point was Tulsi Gabbard, our Hawaii Congress member, although Tulsi didn't even receive 1,000 votes in the ranked choice system. So it was pretty dominant for Vice President Biden. On the next slide, voter turnout in our party primary did increase by 3.9%. If you just look at the raw numbers, it went from 33,000 in 2016 to 35,000 in 2020. And then finally, on the next slide, lessons learned. What went well? Again, logistics. It just made it so much easier for everyone to register and to vote. And the challenges were the cost. The party was responsible for raising the funds to pay for the system. The party raised $230,000 for the Merriman contract. The second challenge was public education, voter education. I think that there were some party members who didn't really understand the ranked choice system, although efforts have been made to educate the public about it. So that's an area that will continue to need to be focused on. Okay, so that is my last. I think one more slide. Mahalo, which is thank you very much. And I will. I'm not sure if I should take questions now, Wendy, or
Yes.
should I wait?
Yes, let's have you take some questions now, because I know you've got a tight schedule and you may have to sneak out before we're completed here. Stan wants to know how you decided how many vote centers would be needed. I mean, we saw that the number of polling places went from 200 and some down to something like 35 drop boxes. How did you know what was the right number?
Yeah, that was just really, that was arbitrary. That was a legislative call. There was discussion during the session in May 2019 on the number of voters centers. We basically deferred to the elections officials. It was, and they made the call on the number. I think that we will probably have to increase the number of centers, or at least give the election officials the flexibility to create more on their islands as needed.
I know in Colorado, when they went to all mail in 2013, they had a certain requirement for how many they'd have. And they've decided that the election administrators think that they could make do with fewer. So maybe there's a little bit of test it out and see how it goes on what's the right number.
And I think that the drop boxes were actually very popular. That was, the clerks created the drop box system, and that was really helpful.
Got it. So you've got the in-person vote, and then you've got the drop boxes. Jennifer asks if the Republican Party in Hawaii did or didn't use ranked choice voting in their primary.
They did not use ranked choice.
Okay. All right. It'd be interesting to see if they do otherwise. Now, you have put on the pro side for both the ranked choice voting and the all-mail voting that it gave voters more of an opportunity. Did you hear from voters that they liked these options, or what was that like? How do you know that that was working for them?
So the Democratic Party did receive a lot of input from members. And I think in part the ranked choice voting system at the party level was driven by the party membership. So there was a response from the party members. And I think for the, on the all-mail system, just the fact that the turnout increased by 50% tells us that, people appreciated that system.
Okay, one of the things we're getting the most questions about these days at NCSL is about all-mail voting, and I always say these are the states, and Hawaii is the most recent to adopt, and you might want to check in with them about what their process was like. Here's another question for you. Do you have a sense yet of whether Hawaii might do state-run presidential primary in 2024, or do you think you'll stick with party-run nominating processes?
Yeah, that's a difficult, that's a difficult issue. The party just feels very proprietary about that system, and wants to run it, and does not want to make it a state-run election. So for now, I think it'll just remain with the party.
Got it. And then we had a comment from Lisa, who's up in Washington, and she cast her absentee or her mail ballot early by dropping it in a drop box, I believe. And she said that when it was time for the date of the primary in Washington, 25%, some of the candidates had already dropped out, so that meant 5% of the ballots were for candidates that were no longer on the ballot. I don't know if you have a comment about that, and we can certainly bring that up again when we get to Rob if we need to. If you vote early, you don't get a chance to respond to a last-minute surprise, I guess is the message there.
Yeah. So for the party primary, all of the candidates were basically on the ballot, unless they had withdrawn. Not all of them had withdrawn by the deadline. So, but even with that, I mean, Vice President Biden was the clear winner, and as I mentioned, our Congressperson, who was still a candidate, didn't receive 1,000 votes. Right.
Well, okay, with that, I want to say thank you to you. We'd love to have you stay on if you've got the time. If you have to sneak away, just give us a wave and we'll say goodbye. Okay. And Secretary Pate, are you ready? Are you there, lined up? Got some comments for us?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for having me on this esteemed panel. As you know, Iowa plays a unique role in the presidential nominating process, as we're the first in the nation caucus state. Make it clear that the Iowa caucuses are run entirely by the political parties and are not an official state of Iowa election. My office doesn't play any official role in overseeing them, but however, I'm a strong advocate for keeping Iowa first in the nation because our voters are excellent at vetting candidates and narrowing the field. Our level of civic engagement in this state is second to none. Candidates have to earn Iowans' votes by looking them in the eye and answering the tough questions. We're also an easy state for candidates to travel and inexpensive for advertising. So the most well-funded candidates aren't necessarily the ones who will succeed. Doing well in the Iowa caucuses requires building a true grassroots following, and you just can't throw millions of dollars off of ads and think that that'll be sufficient. When we look at what happened in this year's caucuses, I think it's clear that adding technology to the situation did not help matters. It actually made it worse. We learned the same thing in the elections arena not too long ago. In the early 2000s, the big push was to move forward electronic touchscreen voting machines. A lot of states have realized that that probably wasn't the best solution, and they went back to the good old-fashioned paper ballots. That's what we use in Iowa's elections, and that is what we will continue to use. For every election, there's got to be a paper trail and post-election audits. Technology certainly does have a role in improving our elections, as we've seen in our state with the electronic poll books. However, the technology has to be thoroughly tested ahead of time, which appeared to be one of the problems that the Democrat Party ran into with the Iowa caucuses this last cycle. And obviously, cybersecurity is a constant threat that all election officials must take seriously. It's a race with no finish line. Moving forward, adjustments are going to have to be made if political parties are going to run caucuses, especially while using new technology. We need to provide transparency ahead of the process to make sure everyone is well trained. I'll note that the Republican Party's approach to the Iowa caucus is different than the Democrats. Republicans simply cast their vote for their preferred candidate. With the Democrats, there's a 15% threshold, and then they have multiple rounds of voting and a lot of complicated math involved that probably needs to be reevaluated ahead of 2024. I hope they will, and that will also help us be able to keep Iowa's first in the nation. Looking past the caucuses, we also held a June primary in Iowa that included a U.S. Senate, U.S. House campaigns, as well as state legislative and local races. And when the pandemic hit here in Iowa in March, we had to make some tough decisions quickly about how to conduct a clean, fair election in June, not knowing what things are going to look like, actually. I made a decision to send absentee ballot request forms to all active registered voters in the state. Absentee voting has been in place in Iowa for several years, and about 40% of Iowans typically would vote absentee in that kind of election. As we all know, nothing has been typical about 2020. We actually had 80% of the voters in that primary who used the absentee approach. However, we already had an infrastructure in place for absentee, so some people did disagree with my decision, others praised it. In the end, this was about keeping the voters and the poll workers safe while running a smooth, clean election. The results, as I said, were better than we could have possibly imagined. We had no lines at the polling locations. We had significant record turnout. And despite an ongoing pandemic and civil unrest across the state, Iowans were determined to make their voices heard in the best possible way by voting. More than 530,000 votes were cast in the June primary, shattering the existing record by more than 80,000 votes. It went as smooth as could have possibly hoped for. We had to merge polling sites because we were having challenges with recruiting poll workers. Our typical poll worker is a senior citizen age. They're a high-risk population in the COVID scenario, so we had to shift, and we allowed our counties to consolidate most of those sites, and we went from about 1,600 polling sites to about 500, and that was done because of the success in absentee. We didn't feel we needed to worry about lines, and it did work out that way. The election was a terrific example of counties, state agencies, and the federal government working together to ensure that Iowans could vote safely. Congress and President Trump made funds available through the CARES Act that allowed us to provide personal protective equipment and other resources to the counties. We worked with Homeland Security and Emergency Management, the Iowa National Guard. Many of these were key in this. The Guard delivered over almost 3,000 gallons of hand sanitizer across the state for us. These are logistics that most election folks never had to deal with before, including all the masks, gloves, and various other things that were needed. So these were all part of what we had to do to make sure we were voting safely in the election. We were able to get the election results reported quickly that night due to an emergency directive that I issued that allowed our county auditors to begin processing the absentee ballots ahead of election day. That's something we typically would do in a general election, but we've never really done it in a primary. So we extended that to the primary, and that helped immensely. The lessons learned are teamwork is essential. Local, state, and federal agencies working together to ensure a smooth process is crucial. Making decisions quickly that might not please everyone, but are based on safety and security are vital. As election managers, we prepare for the worst, but we hope for the best. And that's what we're going to be doing as we look into November. And just to give you a plug, we just sent out our statewide absentee ballot request forms to our 2 million voters. They would have gotten those in the mailboxes starting on Saturday, and they're getting them through probably today. And they will be hopefully responding back. We have one of the highest voter participation rates in the country, and we want to keep building off of that and give Iowans choices. They can vote in person at the county courthouse, they can vote absentee, they can vote at satellite voting, and of course they have their traditional voting on the polling sites come election day. We have online voter registration, and we too have the tracking ability, so when people request a absentee ballot form, they can go online and see if it's been received. It'll show when the auditor sends out their ballot to them, and the reverse process when the auditor gets the ballot back. We also use, we were the first state to use the IMB barcodes on the absentee ballots so that we know when your ballot was actually received originally by the post office, so we don't come into this question mark of did it get lost somewhere in the mail, was it delayed, did it meet the postmark date that we set by our state law. So we feel we've got a lot of great tools out there, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Wow, that was so much in those few minutes that we allotted you. I am just so excited for you. It feels as though Iowa's a state that's done a lot of experimentation, and some exciting things have come out. And you touched on tech at the front end with tech doesn't always serve you, but then you touched on tech on the back end about the intelligent mail barcodes and the ballot tracking system that you've got. So I guess well-deployed tech is what we're looking for? I don't know.
Most certainly, and I will tell you that one of the priorities I set when I first came back into office was the electronic poll books. I swear by those. They're the greatest tool an election official could ever get, having their fingertips. It gives us the checks and balances so that when people come in, we know if they voted absentee or not. And so there's no double voting. We have provisional ballots if there's any question, of course. But those kinds of tools are so crucial for our poll workers on the local level.
Great. We have a question from Stan, and that's how many polling places do you expect to have open in November, and how many people percentage-wise do you expect will be voting in person? I know those things are hard to tell at this point, and you're sending out the applications, so we'll soon know, but what can you tell us so far?
Well, those are driven a lot by how many poll workers we can recruit to sign up. We need about 10,000 poll workers to successfully staff our polls across the state. We also deal with poll sites. Again, due to COVID, we had a lot of private sites who just didn't want to use their facilities. Our state law, though, does direct that our schools need to make themselves available, but we're trying to be good neighbors and work with the schools if they're trying to do classes. And with COVID, these are all challenges our local election folks are facing. We launched a poll worker recruiting initiative during the primary, and we recruited about 1,000 new poll workers. We started early this cycle, and we already have over 4,500 poll workers identified and growing. So I'm pretty confident we'll probably have almost all the polling sites open, assuming we can lock down the sites.
Understood. That's great. Now, another thing that you mentioned is that your local and your state folks are working really well together, and you mentioned DHS in that. Because you've been around for a few years, could you comment on the role the federal government played in 2016 compared to now? I know this is off script, but it's my impression that in 2016 they sort of weren't a player, and now they seem like they're hand in glove with the states. What do you think?
we have come so far. I can't state that strongly enough from 2016 to today. One of the first priorities was we had to establish a vocabulary so that they were talking elections language, not their language, if you will. So that took us some time, but we have successfully, I think, a very positive relationship, lines of communication, their understanding that we're not the same as some of the other critical infrastructure things they're used to dealing with, like power companies and those types of scenarios. So yes, they were very important to us. We now share almost real-time information. We're able to monitor what's going on across the country. So if an election center operation in the East Coast is having a problem, they can share it with the rest of us so we can head it off. So it does help us battle back against these bad actors and also potential technical issues that might come up so that we can be better partners. So I would give us A+ on working well together.
Okay, don't go away. I'm going to ask Rob to ask his question to you directly, and then we'll turn over to Rob. Rob, go ahead and ask Secretary Pate.
Great to meet you, Secretary Pate. Yeah, I just put my question in the chat box, but you know, fingers crossed is what I wrote, that we would really hope COVID-19 doesn't get worse for all kinds of reasons, for our economy and health and everything else. But for our elections, if it did, and there was sort of like this health mandated belief that we should lock down more, I was just wondering, given how well you've been negotiating this complicated terrain this year, you know, what if we find out on October 1st, you know, that Iowa has to enter in a more severe lockdown that could affect poll workers and so on. I was just wondering how you're sort of anticipating that kind of worst case scenario.
Well, based on our success in the primary, I think we could focus more on that approach even more aggressively. We've had a record turnout in our primary. General election wise, Iowans vote, they just do. And I'm looking at, I easily could see 80% of the people casting their ballot in the fall primary will use absentee. So what you're talking about is how do we reach that last 20%? And so clearly we'd have to go out and really underscore and promote folks to use the absentee approach. And we have a no excuse absentee process in Iowa. So we don't have to have notaries. There's not a lot of red tape to getting it done. So I'm pretty comfortable that we could ramp it up and put a lot more emphasis on it. We've had to do that with the care centers, you know, the senior centers and those facilities. So in their cases, you know, with COVID, you just couldn't send poll workers in to help cast their ballot. So we do have the experience, and I guess I'm comfortable that we can ramp that up and be successful if we see a COVID crisis.
Great. Thank you so much, Secretary. And Rob, with that, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll keep taking questions at the end for any of our speakers.
Great. I'll use a PowerPoint here as well. Is that visible at this point? Oh, it's not visible because I haven't shared the screen. That'll do it every time. Sorry about that. Here we go. Okay. Theoretically, this should be now shared.
Indeed it is. Go for it.
Oh, there we go. So I'm going to zero in on a particular piece of the puzzle that Representative Psyche talked about a bit from Hawaii, but was an important part of the process in several states, and I think raises kind of some important policy conversations going forward about the idea of using ranked choice voting ballots in presidential primaries and caucuses. As a reminder about ranked choice voting, it's coming up as a conversation more and more across the country as we encounter the limitations of a system where you can indicate only a single choice and get like a top of the heap winner or plurality vote winner in these increasingly crowded races. We have a number of congressional primaries, one this year, one with very low percentages of the vote, just one in Massachusetts last week, one with less than 22%, one in Tennessee with less than 20%, in seats where that winner is now going to go into Congress. And there's just a conversation about, is that enough? And should we be asking more? Ranked choice voting is a system that those who support it believe it addresses problems of vote splitting, wasted votes like that. and some of the strategic voting that comes with the current system. So what you do is you get a ballot that rather than just pick one is you're essentially picking backup choices. You're having a ballot that allows you to do a second choice if you so choose and a third choice and so on. When you're electing one person, you add up all those first choices, that's your vote. And if someone gets over half, you have a winner. But say you have a situation like this where the top candidate has over 40 but not over 50, you would go to the next round. And the candidate in the last place is out, sort of logically, that candidate has lost, and those ballots are added to the totals of the next ranked choice, and you continue until a candidate tops 50%. So every ballot only counts one at a time for a person, but you're getting these backups. So these are places that are using it in some form. One interesting use of it is for a number of southern states use it for all their overseas voters when they have a runoff election in congressional primaries. That'll be happening in Louisiana, say in November, where overseas voters and out-of-state military voters get a ranked ballot, so that ballot can count in their runoff, and they can have their runoff closer to the first round. You have some cities and states using it for everything. In 2020, there were some important uses. Maine is the state that's most sort of farthest along in using ranked choice voting. They used it for all their congressional and state primary elections in August, including a Republican primary, which went to an instant runoff. It'll use it for its U.S. Senate and presidential elections in November, both of which have at least 4 candidates, and it'll probably kick in and have an impact. The Indiana Republican Party and the Virginia Republican Party used it in some significant contests, picking an attorney general nominee, a congressional nominee. Both of those races actually changed the first choice outcome. Both major parties in Utah, kind of dealing with the challenges of COVID, had virtual state conventions and used ranked choice voting and seemed quite pleased with the process. A total of 7 city and county elections will have it. And then what I'll focus on today is this use of it in presidential primaries, for party-run primaries for all their voters. In Nevada did just for their early voters in tandem with their traditional caucus. And the idea came up in these contests really as these parties that are running their own contests sort of grappled with how can we make it easier for a vote, sort of open the process, and ranked choice voting kind of solved a problem. And we heard a little bit about it in Hawaii. But the problem is, how do you allow people to vote absentee, to vote without being in person in a traditional caucus when they could move to a backup choice, as Secretary Pate mentioned, as Democrats do? Well, a ranked ballot kind of effectively does that. And so all these uses this year were done by the party rule. So it wasn't a decision of the state party, but it was. Or rather, the state government, it was a choice of the party. A state law could be passed to use ranked choice voting. That's one thing that we'll touch base on. It just needs to accommodate party rules that can be differing based on the party. So really think of it as a ranked choice ballot in tandem with the rules. So the ballot would look something like this. Democrats had this tallying system. So they have a 15% threshold. So rather than that one I showed earlier where you need to get 50% to win, you're essentially trying to say you want every remaining candidate to have reached the threshold of 15%. So that if you have a crowded field like the Democrats had, that Republicans had in 2016, and I think we can anticipate in open contests going forward, you can have a lot of candidates that get 5%, 6%, 7%. Ranked choice voting is allowing the people that back those candidates to have a backup choice, and you keep running that tally, last person out, till everyone has at least 15%. So it really had a remarkably a positive impact. It did go hand in hand with going to vote by mail and kind of solve that problem of how more people could participate in these party-run contests and still keep what the parties wanted as far as votes to count. So on a basic threshold measure, you had just more people participating, and a lot of that was tied to using vote by mail. But again, ranked choice voting was sort of the vehicle to allow these states to go to vote by mail. I'll sort of lift up Kansas there, where they had this huge increase in participation, and are really kind of applaud their decision to use ranked choice voting to permit that. So voters, first time out, getting a ballot like this for the first time. And we were really pleased with how people engaged with it. A lot of the voting took place after the contest was effectively decided, but not all of the ballots. Like a lot of the ballots in some of the states were sent before it was effectively decided. But even still about 3 in 4 voters decided to use their rankings and indicate a backup, and that really actually had an impact. Here it is, sort of state by state. You see how it began to decline the farther the year went along, but still, more than half of people using those rankings. So in the states that had ranked choice voting, in the states that didn't, about 90% of voters counted in both kinds of states voted for a candidate who was active at the time of the contest. And then, about 10% didn't. What's different is in the ranked choice states, almost all of those ballots ended up counting for an active candidate as a backup, right? So that's what the ranked choice did. So you look at this in kind of a dramatic level, dark background, 3 million votes, that's a lot of votes, were counted for withdrawn candidates in 2020, meaning the person, when they voted, most of those votes were cast when that person was still active, and by the time they were counted, the person had dropped out. So one of the issues with early voting is you don't know what's happened close. And let's use this as a good example. It actually came up in the chat box earlier. But Washington State, you could really see this quite well, because on election night, about half the ballots, total ballots that were ultimately counted in the primary, were counted early, had been cast early. And of those ballots, over a third were people who had dropped out. The ballot was counted for the candidates who had dropped out, like a Bloomberg or a Buttigieg or a Warren. With the late arriving ballots that were counted after that, that number dropped to 6%, right? So that once voters knew that their first choice was no longer active, they changed their pattern. And of course, ranked choice voting would avoid needing to have to know, right? You would just be able to indicate your backup. Colorado had a particularly dramatic way of dealing with votes for withdrawn candidates, is they just didn't count them at all as a public vote. So the public record of the Colorado Democratic presidential primary, 14% of the votes that were actually cast are not part of that turnout pattern, because they're just treated as undervotes, even though the people actually did vote for the person and just didn't get a chance to indicate that backup. And there's a quote here from the former Speaker of the House sort of showing how that silences voices. So going forward, we want to sort of lift up some different things that could happen. So state legislatures could move this so it's not just parties acting, that they could establish ranked choice voting as a ballot for presidential primaries. And then the party rules would be applied to that ballot that's been created, and there need to be a communication with people like Secretary Pate about how to do that if, say, Iowa were to have a state-run primary. The parties, let's say Iowa again, if Iowa keeps a caucus, but they want to do things like absentee voting, or they want to allow early voting like they did in Nevada, but keep some of the dynamics of a traditional caucus, ranked choice voting is an option for them to kind of make that work. And we expect, some states will continue to have the parties run the contest, as we heard is likely for Hawaii. And so that conversation will happen at the party level. Sort of a bigger, bolder idea is that the states and the parties could actually begin to talk together about how to come up with a system that works for everyone. One thing I've experienced is we are a nonpartisan organization. We find that when you talk about partisan elections, general elections, it just gets more heated about its impact. When you talk about presidential primaries, I feel both parties have a lot in common about what they want to achieve. It's very similar, and there have very similar conversations, but sometimes it's not easy to coordinate. But if they could coordinate about how might we do a schedule that kind of accomplishes our goals of getting a viable nominee, and brings the party together as best as possible and includes as many people as possible, I think there's some important changes that could be done, and that I think the ranked choice voting ballot fits in that, because let's say you had a lot more states voting on a particular day, after some early states kind of define the field, ranked choice voting could still kind of allow early voting to have worked with those contests. Last thing I just mentioned is that there's some thought that Congress could have a helpful role in appropriating money. We know states are going to be hit hard in the pocketbook because of COVID-19, and you know, holding presidential primaries separate from other primaries costs money. That maybe there's a productive role for congressional funding, at least a conversation to have about that. So that's what I wanted to lift up today, and I'll send this back to Wendy.
All right. Well, thank you, Rob. I appreciate very much your comments. The thing that strikes me here is that the states where in the presidential primaries they used ranked choice voting, it was the Democrats who chose to do that. Am I right that all 5 of those states, it was the Democrats that chose to do that? And if that's true, why? It doesn't seem like there's an advantage to Democrats or to Republicans.
Yeah, there isn't. And actually some of these interesting uses of it this year were for both parties. It sort of depends on the context. So the like the Indiana Republican Party, you know, was having COVID-19 challenges, did want to have a state convention where everyone came together. They had this really important job to nominate the Attorney General. They had an incumbent member who was had some sort of perceived scandal, was seen as potentially a challenge to renominate. They had 3 challengers. Ranked choice voting was used to resolve that. He actually led in first choices, but the other candidate vote consolidated around them. Clearly, you know, it's just kind of like a solution to how to handle a crowded field. In the presidential field, it was tied to the fact that one party had a wide open contest and the other party didn't. And I think for state policymakers, you know, looking forward, they'll just sort of set the table, and it'll matter differently for parties based on the kind of contest they have. But we had a lot of Republicans in 2016 in the presidential side really wringing their hands about their crowded field, and a lot of interest in how ranked choice voting could have helped there.
Yeah, so interesting that there was a crowded field on the one side 4 years ago and a crowded field on the other side. And we'll see what the conversation is going forward. Stan wants to know what percentage of ballots tend to come back with just the one vote for their first choice without others.
Yeah, it's always dependent on the nature of the contest. What we found, I shared a slide earlier that it was about 1 in 4. It was, interestingly, like people who voted for Biden or Sanders first, quite logically, were less likely to rank anyone else. Those who voted for someone who was more likely to be below 15% were a lot more like, so about 90% of those voters did. If you have like a big contested mayoral race, you'll usually see about 90% of people rank candidates. I saw there's a comment here, by the way, about our question about Maine and about whether it's going to be used for president or not. It's been kind of a touch and go question about whether so they passed a law to extend ranked choice voting to presidential elections and actually their next presidential primaries, by the way, in 2024. So Maine will be the first state to use it for presidential primaries in 2024 as a state, as a party, you know, a state run law. Anyway, that bill was subject to a referendum effort to people who wanted to block it. And there's a question about whether the signatures have been collected or not. The most recent finding seems to be they have fallen short, and ballots are being printed for president with ranked choice voting on them. And if that for some reason were to change, almost certainly that would only be the referendum would be on a future ballot, and they will use ranked choice voting for president.
Great. So I have a question for all 3 of our speakers. Speaker Psyche, are you still with us there? I'll tell you what the question is.
I'm here, Wendy.
So my question for all 3 of you, but I'm going to go with you first, speaker, is when we're talking about primaries, we're really talking about nominating processes for the parties. What can you tell me about the independent voters in your state and what their roles or interests, or what do you hear? Should they have a role in these processes at all? Are they left out of a part of our democratic process?
Well, I think that the independents are to an extent left out of the primary system. They although, you know, my feeling is that a lot of independents in Hawaii probably register with the Democratic Party, but they, yeah, I think that is an issue that we have to address. How do you include independent voters in a primary system?
Yeah, thank you. Secretary Pate, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we've seen a distinct trend now for the first time in at least a long time that I'm aware of, the Republican Democrat Party actually outnumbers the no party voter registrations now in our state. And, you know, in all fairness, the concept of nominating someone from your political party should probably be done by people of that political party.
Mhm.
The people who are no party want to have a voice in that. They have to make a decision in the early stages of choosing one of those parties. It's very simple to do in our state. When you go into the primary, or you can go to a caucus, you say, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat for this particular vote. They can turn right around and change back to being no party. But
Right.
for the nomination process, I think it's a party building situation, and I believe the parties should have a pretty significant voice in that.
Great.
Can I just
And-
add one thing, Wendy, really quickly? Sorry, I just thought of this.
Oh, please, please.
So for our caucus system, you'd have to be a party member to vote. But in the regular primary election, there is no requirement for you to declare what party or what your party affiliation is. So independents there's a lot of cross voting that goes on within our official formal primary system.
That makes sense. And we do have a state primaries type page, and we'll get that in the chat box for people too to see. Rob, do you want to jump in on the role of independent voters?
I'll just say it's a conundrum that I think is particularly well. We're just going to have it be talked about more and more because younger people are less likely to register in the major parties, and it's I think building a system for tomorrow as well as today. I think we need to figure out a role for people who make that choice, and there. One option is to open up primaries. The points made earlier about is that really what a party wants, and but then do we have a general election system that kind of accommodates that political energy, and that's one of the conversations that ranked choice voting allows. Is like, well, let's figure out a way to let more people in at that level. But it is one that you have in some states. I think it's Oregon. Like about half of the registered voters are actually not able to vote in their primaries. And, at what point does that become something we just can't, there's something wrong with it. And the last thing I'll say about Hawaii is that fact that a lot of independents are used to voting in their primaries without registering was sort of an issue in the presidential primary. And they were like, well, why didn't I get my ballot, my presidential ballot? Well, it's because they hadn't registered as a Democrat, but they felt sort of outraged about it. So it is something that we experienced that on the voter education side in Hawaii.
Got it. I'm going to ask Secretary Pate to start on the next one, and he can start with answering Stan's question about whether your electronic poll books are networked so that your information is real time. That's a real quick answer. But then I'd like you to address, and then I'll come to the other two speakers as well, the timing of primaries. Earlier, is it better? Later? We've got that dovetails with, should state primaries and presidential primaries be combined into one, or are they better run separately? Right now, we're most in Hawaii and in Iowa, they're run separately, but they can be put together. So that's a lot out there. Secretary Pate, you first, and electronic poll books, and then timing and whether the two primaries should be run together.
Well, I'm the chair of the Cyber Committee for the National Association of Secretaries of State. Ultimately, our goal would be, yes, we'd like to have them be networked. At the present time, we're uncomfortable. I'll speak for state of Iowa, because until we are comfortable that we have got the security measures there to ensure that no one can manipulate or get into the system, we're not going to do that yet. So we don't allow them to network them presently. And we're looking at the future, of course. And to your second part of your question about where we're going here, I guess I would say that this is a very distinguished panel, and as a Republican, not as Secretary of State, I may have an opinion on how I want to see the primaries handled, because again, I'm a strong believer that the primaries are part of the party building process. And they're the ones that recruit the candidates. They're the ones who support the candidates. They're the ones who drive the election process. And frankly, I believe the political parties are the ones who have a lot to say about what the voter turnout will be. Because if they recruit good candidates and have a very spirited campaign, you have higher voter turnout. As an elections commissioner for the state of Iowa, I'm going to do my darndest to try to get every Iowan to take their civic duty seriously. But at the end of the day, it's the campaigns and the political parties who drive this. And they have this battle every 4 years when we start talking about the presidential side. What state's going to be first, which one's third. It's not a real pretty process, to put it politely.
I got you. But asking you that question, you need to keep your position on that calendar, and I know that's super important. Speaker Psyche, anything about putting the two primaries, the presidential and the state, together, or when you'd like to run it in the front end of the calendar or the back end? Should it move? Should it always be the same? What do you think?
Well, I think part of the issue, if you combine the two, is whether or not you would have to have a closed primary system and limit the primary voters to those who declare a party affiliation. And because we have Hawaii has an open system, so anyone can cross in the primary election. There was a lawsuit about 10 years ago by some party, Democratic Party, who sued to bring back a closed system, and the federal court rejected that claim. So I think it's a fine line between how open do you want the system to be in a primary election.
Great. And we are coming right up on the hour. I don't see any more questions in the chat box. I thought I would offer that this was about lessons learned. And so if we could quickly go around one more time and ask each of you, when it's 6 months from now, what do you think we're going to be talking about? Will it be, what kinds of lessons might we have to learn from 6 months from now with the general election under our belt? And speakers, I can go for it.
Well, fortunately, this hasn't happened in Hawaii yet, but I think that the issue will be the reliability of the mail-in system and what ballots are actually received and counted.
Okay, I like that. And that's something that NCSL is trying to be on top of for the legislative session yet to come. What are the policy choices that can be made to make that run smoothly? We don't control, of course, the Postal Service, but there's lots and lots of things that can happen around the drop boxes and the processing deadlines. Great, thank you so much. Rob, I'll go to you next, and then we'll close with Secretary Pate.
Yeah, I think how do we deal with elections in a pandemic, and voting remotely is now becoming, I think, a necessity for more people. And just in my ranker's voting hat, I think that means, more ballots going out early, more people voting earlier, and it's things like sequentially held primaries. It just becomes very apparent that idea of giving people a backup is going to be a conversation. When I think about 3 million votes lost because they voted for withdrawn candidates compared to, say, 600,000 or whatever the number was, which is still way too high for ballots that had problems in the processing for vote by mail. It seems like those are both things that we can make improvements on.
Great. Okay, and Secretary Pate, what are you thinking you'll be talking about 6 months from now?
Well, first I'd say that many of the states are going to be looking at, you just don't do vote by mail overnight.
No.
The state of Washington did theirs. It took them 5 years to ramp up to be where they're at today. So for those states who got thrown into this cycle, they're going to be feeling, wow, we really messed that one up, or we really hit a home run here. Those are going to be issues. But the real issue is not a new one. It's getting worse and more challenging, and that is dealing with misinformation. That is causing people to perhaps become disenfranchised, to lose confidence and saying, that's not my governor, that's not my president, because of the nonsense that people are putting out there at all different directions. I can go down the list, and it's not just political parties. We've got the Russians, and we've got the Chinese, and we've got others who are doing their little games as well. But we need to stand a little more firmer on, look, the mail works. Look, our absentee program works. Do we have bumps? Yes, but we have safeguards, and remind the voters of all the safeguards, the checks and balances. I think the United States has a great track record. So got to stand tall on that.
Yeah, I love that. As I'm so glad that you got the final word here, because you're absolutely right. Election officials around this nation do everything they possibly can to run a good election, to give voters choice on how they do it, to run safe elections, whether it's in a polling place or by absentee. We've got the safeguards. We've got it all in place. And then I'll also just say that you talked about misinformation. We got no misinformation on this call. We only got straight up good information. So I so appreciate that. So for everyone on the call, stay safe, stay calm, stay engaged, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.